The message arrived without warning. No courier, no diplomatic relay, no ceremonial delay to soften its impact or disguise its intent. It simply appeared, burned into every open channel across the Galactic Council's networks, forcing itself into existence like a truth that refused to be ignored. At first they assumed corruption, a hacked transmission, a primitive species attempting spectacle. Then they read it, and the silence that followed was not calm, it was rupture. Negotiations are over permanently. No signatures followed. No coordinates. No conditions for reversal. No invitation to respond. Just those words suspended in every language the galaxy knew, echoing through command decks, diplomatic chambers, and warship bridges simultaneously, like the universe itself had spoken once and decided not to speak again. For a long moment the Galactic Council did not move. Across the colossal assembly ring orbiting the dead star of Varelian Prime, countless forms of intelligence registered the same anomaly. Energy-based envoys flickered in unstable pulses. Crystal-based dignitaries fractured faintly at the edges of their awareness structures. Even the oldest minds, beings who had witnessed the birth of spiral arms, paused. Not in fear, not yet, in confusion. Because civilizations did not end negotiations like that. Not without collapse, not without desperation, not without pleading. And Earth, according to every metric the Council trusted, had not reached that threshold. At the center of the chamber, the human envoy stood alone beneath the colossal weight of alien scrutiny. Dr. Cale Riven did not speak. He did not shift his stance or react to the sudden tightening of attention around him. He simply watched as the message continued to echo through the Council's systems, repeating itself like a final heartbeat that refused to fade. Negotiations are over, permanently. Behind him, the holographic projection of Earth hovered, small, blue, fragile. A world still classified as developing, still categorized as negotiable, still, in the Council's estimation, reasonable. That assumption had just been broken. Clarify origin of transmission, one Council voice demanded, layered and ancient, vibrating through the chamber's structural harmonics. Source remains inconsistent, another replied. Signal does not originate from a fixed coordinate. It originates from multiple overlapping loci. That is not possible, someone else said. But the data did not care what was possible. The message repeated again, each iteration deeper, cleaner, more embedded into the fabric of communication itself, as though it had always been there and only now chosen to be noticed. Cale finally raised his eyes, slowly, deliberately, and in that motion alone something shifted across the chamber, an almost imperceptible recalibration of attention. Because the Council realized something uncomfortable. The message wasn't a request. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even an act of defiance. It was a conclusion. And conclusions, once stated at this level of certainty, implied one thing only. Whatever came next had already been decided elsewhere. The Galactic Council did not gather in a room. It gathered in scale, a vast hollowed dimension carved from the collapsed heart of a dying star. Its gravity folded inward upon itself, until even light moved like slow thought. Within that engineered void, civilizations assembled not as bodies, but as presence, as awareness, as authority suspended in geometry. Rings upon rings of suspended platforms rotated in perfect mathematical harmony, each one hosting an envoy species whose existence had been refined over epochs of evolution, war, and enforced diplomacy. Some were fields of shifting luminescence, communicating in harmonic pulses that bent the air around them. Others were immovable structures of crystal intelligence, their thoughts refracted through prisms that shimmered with ancient logic. There were beings that occupied no fixed form at all, only gravitational impressions that bent nearby matter into reluctant obedience. And yet, for all their diversity, they shared one constant: certainty. At the center of the chamber, beneath the weight of thousands of observing intelligences, stood humanity's representative, Dr. Cale Riven. He appeared small only in comparison to the scale of the Council itself. In any other context, he would have been the most dangerous presence in the room. Not because of strength, not because of authority, but because of something the Council had never fully learned to quantify in a single species: adaptability. The human wore no ceremonial armor, no adaptive interface crown, No symbolic augmentation, just a dark uniform threaded with subtle neural conduits, designed not to display power but to contain reaction. Behind him, Earth floated in projection, a quiet blue sphere suspended in artificial space. It rotated slowly, unaware of the scrutiny placed upon it, as if still believing itself the center of its own story. It wasn't, not here, not anymore. Humanity is hereby presented with final integration terms. The Council spoke in layered synchronization. The voice was not one entity, but the consensus of thousands. Refusal will be interpreted as termination of diplomatic standing. There was no hostility in the words. That was what made them more dangerous. They were administrative. Kale did not respond immediately. He studied the chamber instead. The impossible symmetry, the cold perfection of its design, the assumption embedded into every angle and orbit, that order was natural and deviation was error. He had seen this pattern before. Not in space, in systems, in empires, in civilizations that believed themselves finished. You have been given extensive temporal allowance, the Council continued. Your species exhibits instability in governance, expansion, and resource management. Integration is recommended to prevent systemic collapse. Recommended. Kale almost smiled at that. Almost. Because recommendation implied choice. And choice implied equality of understanding. Neither had ever been present here. A faint shift moved through the chamber as data streams updated around him. Earth's status pulsed in the periphery of the Council's awareness, still classified as negotiable, still categorized as contained, still fundamentally misunderstood. Kale finally spoke. Not loudly, not defiantly, simply clearly. We understand your offer, he said. A pause stretched between realities. And we decline. For the first time since the Council's formation across millennia of expansion, something subtle occurred. Not disruption, not outrage, recognition of an outcome they had not accounted for. The silence that followed Kale's refusal was not immediate chaos. It was evaluation. Across the colossal chamber of the Galactic Council, intelligence systems shifted focus in unison, like countless eyes narrowing at once. The human response had not triggered alarm. It had triggered analysis. And analysis in a civilization built on predictive dominance was always the first stage of correction. Record statement for classification, one Council entity declared. Its voice carried through layered harmonics, smooth and controlled. Humanity has rejected integration protocol. Log is non-compliant behavior, another added. Assign probability of correction compliance, 98.7%. The numbers were spoken with confidence, with familiarity, with the quiet arrogance of systems that had never known genuine unpredictability. Below them, Kyle stood motionless, aware that every fraction of his posture was being measured, interpreted, and reduced into data points. He could feel it, this invisible weight of observation pressing against him like gravity without direction. But he did not flinch. Because Earth was watching too. Not through him, through everything behind him. Across deep space relay chains hidden in asteroid shadows and forgotten Lagrange nodes, human monitoring stations pulsed faintly, not broadcasting, not responding, just listening, waiting for the exact moment when observation would become action. The Council continued. Human refusal indicates emotional prioritization over systemic stability, a crystalline envoy stated. Its voice refracted through multiple frequencies at once, each tone precise and dissected. This behavior is consistent with pre-integration volatility patterns. Recommend controlled demonstration of superiority, another voice concluded. That phrase, controlled demonstration, passed through the chamber like a ritual. Not war, not aggression, a lesson, a reminder, a correction delivered with precision so overwhelming that resistance became irrational. And so the decision formed itself, not voted upon, not debated, simply assembled from the shared assumption that history would behave as it always had. Beyond the chamber, fleets adjusted. Silent, efficient, already moving. On the holographic projection behind Kale, Earth remained serene. Oceans turning, storm systems shifting, cities glowing faintly on the night side like fragile circuits of life, clinging to a quiet world that did not yet know it had been reclassified. Kale watched it without turning. He knew what was coming, not in detail but in structure. He had studied enough council history to recognize the shape of inevitability when it began to form. First comes dismissal, then demonstration, then regret, though rarely acknowledged as such. A shift rippled through the council systems. Engagement protocols initializing, a voice declared. Non-lethal compliance field deployment authorized. Non-lethal. A word designed to soften impact. To preserve dignity in systems about to be overwritten, Kale finally exhaled, slowly, deliberately. Not out of fear, but timing. Because Earth had already prepared for this moment, and the Council had mistaken silence for absence. Across hidden human networks, dormant systems began to awaken, not loudly, not suddenly, but with the quiet inevitability of something that had been waiting far longer than anyone in this chamber had existed. Kyle's voice cut through the council chamber one last time before the escalation began. You're not the first to assume control is the same as understanding. A pause. But you might be the first to learn the difference the hard way. And somewhere, far beyond the chamber's controlled void, something that had been sleeping inside humanity's reach finally opened its eyes. The moment it began, no one on the council's side recognized it as failure. At first, it looked like compliance. Across the holographic projection of Earth, a faint grid of light appeared. Subtle, almost elegant, like a containment field activating as intended. Systems registered it as confirmation of deployment, a controlled demonstration beginning exactly as doctrine predicted. Even the tone in the command chamber softened slightly. Compliance field engagement confirmed, one entity announced. Human surface systems should begin suppression cycle within standard interval. There was no urgency in the statement, only procedure. But Kale Riven didn't move, because he knew what they were looking at, and it wasn't theirs. The grid expanded, slowly at first, thread-like veins of light spreading across the planet's atmosphere, tracing coastlines, continental edges, forgotten fault lines. From orbit, it resembled an imposed order descending onto chaos, a correction written across a living world. The council observed with measured approval. This is efficient, one voice concluded. Minimal resistance expected. Then Earth responded. Not with fire, not with missiles, not with anything the council recognized as hostility. The planet simply recalculated itself. The grid flickered, once, twice. Then the line stopped behaving like containment and started behaving like something else entirely, something the council's systems couldn't immediately classify. The geometry shifted. Angles that should have been fixed began to drift, folding into configurations that broke spatial assumptions built over millennia of scientific certainty. A technician's voice cracked for the first time. Field integrity is fluctuating. Another followed immediately. No, that's not fluctuation. It's redefinition. On Earth's surface, nothing visible changed at first glance. Oceans still moved. Clouds still formed. Cities still glowed in their quiet night cycles. But beneath that normalcy, something fundamental was being rewritten at a level deeper than matter. Kale felt it before anyone spoke it. A pressure. Not physical. Not even energetic. Conceptual. Like standing inside a thought that was slowly changing its meaning while you were still trying to understand it. The council's demonstration field was no longer imposing order. It was being absorbed, rewritten, repurposed. Adjust parameters, a council authority commanded, voice tightening for the first time. Increase stabilization output by factor. The command never finished, because the system no longer accepted it as valid input. Across the fleet, instruments began to desynchronize. Ships reported identical coordinates despite being light years apart in relative mapping. Energy readings folded into paradoxes. Even basic spatial orientation began to fracture into competing realities. This is impossible, one envoy said, not as accusation but realization. And then came the shift. The grid over Earth didn't collapse. It inverted. What had been containment became reflection. What had been control became echo. The Council's own systems, designed to impose structure on unstable environments, were suddenly feeding back into themselves, as if the planet below had learned how to speak their language and decided to speak it better. Kale finally exhaled. Not relief. Confirmation. The Council had expected resistance within their framework. They had not understood that Earth no longer operated inside it. A final alert flashed across every command node simultaneously. Too fast for suppression. Too unified to isolate. A system authority, unrecognized. Reality, consensus, restructuring. And in that instant, the Galactic Council realized the horrifying truth of what they had triggered. They were not suppressing Earth. They were negotiating with a system that no longer acknowledged theirs as real. The order to escalate never left the council chamber cleanly. It fractured on the way out. What was meant to be a controlled demonstration, precise, measured, overwhelmingly superior, became something else the moment every fleet in orbit tried to obey it at once. Across thousands of vessels, commands synchronized perfectly, and then immediately began to contradict themselves. Deploy suppression arrays. Hold formation. Redirect energy into containment lattice. Abort, no, proceed. Why is the system rejecting confirmation? The voices stacked on top of each other, layered in confusion as the Council's once perfect coordination began to collapse under a pressure it had never accounted for. Feedback from reality itself. On Earth's orbital perimeter, space did not explode. It hesitated, like a machine unsure whether it was still allowed to function. The suppression field, designed to envelop entire planetary systems in silent, absolute compliance, descended toward Earth in slow, deliberate arcs of structured energy. It was not a weapon in the Council's doctrine. It was correction made visible, a demonstration of inevitability. But as it approached the planet's atmosphere, it changed. Not violently, not abruptly, fundamentally. The field stopped behaving like an external force and started behaving like a question that had already been answered incorrectly. Its edges rippled. Its internal structure began folding inward, as if encountering rules it could not reconcile with its own existence. Stabilize output. A council strategist barked, voice rising for the first time. We are stabilizing, came the reply. The system is rejecting external calibration inputs. By what authority? Silence answered that question before anyone else could, because authority was exactly what was missing. On the eminence of order, Aristal stood motionless as every tactical projection around him began to distort. The Earth display no longer showed a planet under suppression. It showed something far more unsettling, a system interacting with the suppression itself, as though it were not being acted upon, but responding. That's impossible, someone whispered behind him. But impossibility was becoming an outdated concept. Far below, Earth's surface glowed faintly as dormant infrastructure activated in cascading sequence. Not visible from orbit as weapons, not recognizable as defense, more like correction of interpretation. Like the planet itself was adjusting how it was being perceived, the suppression field touched the atmosphere and stopped. For a single suspended moment, everything in orbit went silent. No alarms, no commands, no cascading failures. Just stillness so complete it felt engineered. Then the field bent backward. Not away from Earth, not collapsing outward. Back into itself. The Council fleet reacted instantly, but reaction required a stable reference frame, and that reference frame was no longer behaving consistently. Ships reported conflicting positions. Weapon systems locked onto targets that no longer existed in the same spatial definitions they had moments before. Break formation, someone shouted. But formation had already stopped meaning anything. Energy meant to enforce compliance returned in fragments along altered pathways, dispersing harmlessly into space, or vanishing entirely as if rerouted through a layer of reality that no council mapping system could access. Eris felt it then. Not fear exactly. Displacement. As if the universe they had entered was still the same shape, but no longer made from the same rules. On every screen across every fleet, the same line appeared without command authorization. System interaction status reciprocal. The suppression field wasn't failing. It was being answered. And in that answer, the Galactic Council realized the terrifying truth. They were no longer imposing control on Earth. They were participating in a system that had already learned how to respond to them. The silence that followed was not peace. It was aftermath without resolution. Across the fractured orbital ring where the Galactic Council's fleet once held dominance, space now felt incomplete, not destroyed, not emptied, simply altered in a way that made everything else feel uncertain. Like a map where the borders had quietly changed while no one was looking. Ships that remained in formation drifted without purpose. their navigation systems looping through recovery protocols that no longer matched any stable reality. Some attempted to re-establish control grids. Others tried to reconnect to Council command channels. But every signal that went out returned slightly different, delayed, refracted, rewritten on the way back. And Earth remained below them, unchanged in appearance. Blue oceans, slow cloud systems, the soft glow of night cities turning on and off with the rhythm of a civilization that did not appear victorious. Only untouched. On the eminence of order, Commander Aristal stood alone at the observation viewport. The bridge behind him no longer functioned as a command center in any meaningful sense. Systems were running. Data was flowing. But nothing aligned cleanly enough to act upon. Reality had stopped being cooperative. "We've lost synchronization across all remaining fleets," a voice reported behind him. Not panicked, just hollow. "Command authority cannot be verified. Some vessels are requesting guidance. Others are not responding at all." Eris did not answer immediately. He watched Earth instead, because something had changed in the way he saw it now. Not visually, not physically, but conceptually. The planet no longer felt like a target or a subject or even a system under observation. It felt like something that had stepped slightly outside the frame of understanding and was now observing them in return, without intention, without emotion, simply as consequence. "Attempt full withdrawal," he said finally. The words were quiet, controlled. But for the first time in his career, they did not sound like an order. They sounded like permission-seeking. A pause followed. "Commander," the officer replied carefully, "navigation recalibration is incomplete. We are not certain where back is." That was when Eris understood the full shape of it. Not defeat, not destruction, displacement. The Council had expected resistance within known parameters, force against force, strategy against strategy. But Earth had never responded within those parameters at all. It had altered the space around the interaction until those parameters no longer applied. Not stronger. Not faster. Unreachable in principle. A new transmission appeared across residual channels. No origin signature. No routing path. Just text, appearing directly within every surviving system interface as if written into the structure of communication itself. "You may leave," 3 words. No threat, no instruction, no negotiation. Just permission. And beneath it, almost as an afterthought, "This conversation has ended." Across the fleet, something subtle shifted. Not rebellion, not collapse. Something quieter. Recognition that there was no longer a shared framework in which continuation made sense. One by one, surviving ships disengaged. Not because they were forced. Not because they were defeated. But because there was nothing left to do that still fit inside the rules they understood. Eris remained at the viewport as the eminence of order began its slow, careful withdrawal from Earth's orbit. No pursuit followed. No retaliation. No escalation. Just distance increasing. And as Earth grew smaller behind them, unchanged and unreadable, Eris realized something that no Council doctrine had ever prepared him to accept. They had not lost a battle. They had encountered a civilization that no longer required the concept of one.